clinking of crystal dropped to dead silence. He was a man who noticed everything: the sweat on a liar's brow, the imperceptible tremor in a rival's handshake. But tonight, Leo Castiglione's dark, hollow gaze was fixed squarely on the hired help. Clara's left hand trembled. Her sleeve was pulled down just a fraction too far. She thought she was merely hiding a fractured wrist to keep her job. She didn't realize she had just triggered the deadliest, quietest massacre this city had seen in a decade. The tray weighed 8 pounds empty. Loaded with a heavy silver cloche, roasted lamb, and thick porcelain plates, it was closer to 20. Under normal circumstances, Clara could maneuver it through a crowded dining room with bored, practiced ease. Tonight, holding it felt like balancing a cinder block on a shattered glass bottle. Her left wrist throbbed with a sickening, rhythmic pulse. Every beat of her heart sent a fresh wave of nausea rolling up her forearm. Before her shift, she had wrapped it tight with stolen athletic tape, binding 2 rigid wooden spoons against the swelling to keep the joint from shifting. The stiff, starched sleeve of her black uniform hid the crude splint. It didn't hide the awkward, rigid way she held her arm against her ribcage. Clara stood in the shadows of the formal dining room, waiting for the signal to serve. The air in the room was thick, heavy with the scent of expensive cigars, spilled bourbon, and the metallic tang of unsaid threats. 12 men sat around the long mahogany table. They were not businessmen, despite their tailored suits and silk ties. They were butchers who wore Rolexes. At the head of the table sat Leo Castiglione. Leo wasn't a loud man. He didn't pound his fists or scream when he was angry. He was terrifying precisely because he didn't have to do either. He sat completely still, nursing a glass of mineral water, his dark eyes tracking the micro-expressions of the men around him. He ruled his syndicate with a suffocating, clinical precision. He noticed the scuff on a shoe. He noticed a forced laugh. He was currently noticing Clara. She felt his gaze before she actually saw him looking. It was a physical weight, like the sudden drop in barometric pressure before a thunderstorm. Clara kept her eyes glued to the floorboards. "Just breathe," she told herself. "Pour the wine, serve the plates, collect your cash, and go to the clinic tomorrow." She couldn't afford to lose this shift. She owed rent, her phone was already disconnected, and if she didn't walk out of this estate with $200 in cash tonight, she was sleeping in her rusted Honda Civic. The head butler gave a sharp nod. It was time. Clara stepped out of the shadows. She approached the right side of the table, moving mechanically. She had to use both hands to lower the heavy platters. As she approached the third chair, her blood ran cold. Sitting there, leaning back with a smug, heavy-lidded expression, was Jimmy the Wrench O'Shea. He was one of Leo's mid-level enforcers, a man built like a fire hydrant with a temper to match. He was also the reason Clara's wrist was currently screaming in agony. Yesterday, behind the estate's laundry house, Jimmy had cornered her. He wanted a favor. Clara had refused. When he grabbed her, dragging her toward the storage sheds, she had panicked. She drove the heel of her boot into his knee. In retaliation, he had grabbed her arm, twisted it violently behind her back, and shoved her down a flight of concrete steps. She heard the snap before she hit the ground. Jimmy had laughed, told her to watch her step, and walked away. Now she had to serve him dinner. Clara approached his chair. Jimmy looked up. A slow, greasy smile spread across his face as he recognized her. He shifted in his seat, deliberately leaning back so that his arm blocked her path to the table. "Excuse me, sir," Clara murmured, her voice stripped of any emotion. Jimmy didn't move. "You're shaking, sweetheart," he muttered. just loud enough for her to hear over the din of the conversation. "You ought to be more careful. People who are clumsy around here don't last long." Clara bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper. She adjusted her grip on the platter. The shift in weight transferred directly to her broken wrist. A hot electric wire of pain snapped up her arm, straight to her shoulder. Her breath hitched. A fine sheen of cold sweat broke out on her forehead. She gritted her teeth, forcing her left hand to support the silver tray. She leaned over Jimmy's shoulder, placing the lamb in front of him. As she pulled back, Jimmy subtly shifted his knee under the table, bumping hard into her thigh. Clara stumbled. The heavy silver cloche slipped from her grip. She caught it with her left hand before it could crash onto the mahogany. The impact was agonizing. A sickening crunch echoed in her own ears, though the room's noise drowned it out. White spots danced in her vision. She physically bit back a scream, clamping her jaw shut so hard her teeth ground together. She managed to set the cloche down silently. She didn't drop a single drop of grease, but her left hand immediately curled inward like a dying spider. She pulled her arm tight against her stomach, bowing her head. "Careful," Jimmy whispered, chuckling. Clara backed away, her face pale, chest heaving in shallow, rapid breaths. She retreated to the edge of the room, blending back into the heavy velvet curtains, praying no one had seen the near disaster. Someone had. At the head of the table, Leo Castiglione had stopped listening to the conversation. His mineral water sat untouched. His eyes bypassed the 12 men working for him and locked directly onto the maid standing in the shadows. He had seen the stumble. He had seen Jimmy's knee move. More importantly, he had seen the way the girl caught the tray and the sheer, raw agony that flashed across her face when she used her left arm. He saw how she was holding it now, guarded, protective, trembling. Leo didn't say a word. He slowly reached into his suit jacket, pulled out a silver lighter, and began to turn it over and over in his long fingers. Click, click, click. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. By midnight, the dining room was empty. The bosses and underbosses had retreated to the smoking lounge to discuss maritime shipping routes and extortion rackets. The kitchen, however, was a war zone of clattering pans, shouting chefs, and hissing steam. Clara stood at the massive industrial sink, her back to the chaos. Her shift was over in 10 minutes. If she could just finish scraping the bone marrow off these plates, she could slip out the service door. Her wrist was no longer just throbbing. It was burning. The crude splint had shifted during the dinner service, and the broken bone was grinding against inflamed tissue. Her fingers were swollen and tinged with a deep, ugly purple. She was washing the plates one-handed, clumsily swiping a sponge over the ceramic while keeping her left arm pressed firmly against her side. The heavy swinging doors of the kitchen pushed open. Usually this meant a waiter was coming in to scream at a line cook. But the kitchen suddenly went dead quiet. The clattering stopped. The hissing of the grill seemed to fade. Clara didn't turn around. She was too exhausted, and if she stopped moving, she feared she might just collapse onto the wet tile floor. "Everyone out." The voice was quiet, smooth, and lacked any inflection. It didn't need any. Clara froze. The sponge stopped moving over the plate. Behind her, she heard the frantic, immediate shuffling of feet. The head chef didn't argue. The prep cooks dropped their knives. Within 15 seconds, the sprawling industrial kitchen was entirely empty, save for 2 people. Clara slowly turned off the faucet. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the dripping of water into the stainless steel basin. She turned around. Leo Castiglione stood in the center of the kitchen. He had removed his suit jacket, leaving him in a crisp white shirt and a dark waistcoat. He didn't look like a mob boss from a movie. He looked like a weary, dangerous executive. His dark eyes scanned her, taking in her wet apron, the exhaustion carving lines into her young face, and finally, the left arm she was holding awkwardly against her ribs. "Sir," Clara said. Her voice was raspy. She cleared her throat. "The staff, they were finishing the cleanup." "I know," Leo said. He took a step forward. His shoes made absolutely no sound on the tile. "Walk over here." Clara's heart hammered against her sternum. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. Had she broken something? Had someone complained? Did Jimmy tell him she was a thief or a liability? She forced herself to step away from the sink. She stopped 6 feet away from him, keeping her eyes respectfully on the knot of his tie. "Look at me," he instructed. She raised her chin. Up close, Leo was terrifyingly blank. There was no anger in his face, just a profound, unsettling stillness. "Give me your left arm," he said. Clara instinctively took a half step back. "Excuse me. You heard me." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "Give me your arm. Roll up the sleeve." "I spilled hot water on it earlier, Mr. Castiglione," Clara lied smoothly. Survival had taught her how to lie without her voice shaking. "It's nothing. Just a minor burn. It looks worse than it is. I wouldn't want to bother you with—" Leo closed the distance between them in 2 strides. He didn't grab her violently, but his large hand clamped firmly around her left bicep, holding her in place. Clara gasped, jerking back, but his grip was like iron. "Don't lie to me," he said softly. With his free hand, he reached down and took hold of the cuff of her black uniform sleeve. He didn't bother unbuttoning it. He simply gripped the fabric and ripped it upward, snapping the cheap plastic buttons off. They clattered against the tile floor. Leo stared down at her arm. It was horrific. The skin from her forearm to her knuckles was a bruised canvas of black, indigo, and sickly yellow. The wrist was visibly deformed, swelling outward at an unnatural angle. The athletic tape and blood-stained wooden spoons she had used as a splint dug into her flesh. Clara stopped breathing. She waited for him to fire her. She waited for him to call her a liability and have her thrown out the back door. Leo didn't look repulsed. He didn't look angry. He reached out with 2 fingers and gently, almost clinically, traced the edge of the swelling just above the tape. Clara flinched, a sharp hiss escaping her lips. Leo dropped his hand. He looked up at her face. "That is a displaced fracture," he stated, his voice devoid of emotion. "Bone is scraping against the median nerve. You carried 20 pounds of silver and meat on this tonight." "I needed the shift," Clara whispered. There was no point in lying anymore. The cynical truth was all she had left. "I need the money. If I don't work, I don't eat. I can handle it." "Who did it?" The question hung in the air, heavy as lead. Clara looked away. "I slipped on the ice by the dumpsters. It was my own fault." Leo tilted his head. He stepped closer, invading her personal space. He smelled of clean linen and expensive tobacco. "I employ 20 men to keep this estate clear of ice. We haven't had a freeze in 3 days. He leaned down, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "I saw Jimmy bump your leg. I saw him smile when you nearly dropped the plate. I am going to ask you one more time, and if you lie to me again, I will have the doctor set this bone without anesthetic. Who broke your wrist?" Clara swallowed hard. She looked into his eyes. There was no warmth there, but there was a strange, absolute demand for the truth. "Jimmy," she whispered. Her voice cracked. Yesterday, behind the laundry house, he wanted something. I said no. I kicked him. He threw me down the stairs. Silence stretched between them. Leo didn't blink. He simply stared at her for 5 long seconds. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out his cell phone. "Go to the front hall," Leo commanded, turning his back on her. "My driver Thomas is waiting by the black sedan. He is taking you to a private clinic in the city. You are going to get that pinned and casted. The bill is handled." Clara stood frozen. "What? No, I can't afford a private." "I didn't ask what you could afford." Leo cut her off, bringing the phone to his ear. "Go. Now." Clara clutched her torn sleeve, backing toward the service doors. As she pushed them open, she heard Leo speak into the phone. "Vincent," Leo said, his voice dropping to a register so cold it made Clara's skin crawl. "Lock the gates. Tell Jimmy O'Shea to wait for me in the basement." The basement of the Castiglione estate was not designed for torture. It was simply an unfinished utility room, housing the massive boiler that heated the 40-room mansion, a circuit breaker panel the size of a billboard, and a heavy wooden workbench. It smelled of motor oil, damp concrete, and the faint, coppery tang of old iron. Tonight the boiler was running hot. The room was stifling. Jimmy O'Shea sat on a wooden stool in the center of the room. He was sweating through his expensive silk shirt. At first, when Vincent had told him the boss wanted him downstairs, Jimmy assumed it was a promotion. He had recently muscled 2 rival dealers out of the South Side docks. He expected a bonus. He expected a drink, but 20 minutes had passed. Vincent stood guarding the only steel door, hands clasped in front of him, staring at the concrete wall with dead, unblinking eyes. He hadn't spoken a single word. The heavy lock clicked. The steel door swung open. Leo Castiglione walked into the room. He had rolled the sleeves of his white shirt up to his elbows. He wasn't carrying a weapon. He didn't look angry. He looked like a man about to perform a tedious, mandatory chore. Jimmy stood up immediately, forcing a wide, confident grin. "Boss, you wanted to see me? I was just telling the guys upstairs. The Port Authority is completely in our pocket now. We can move double the shipments by Tuesday." Leo didn't look at him. He walked past Jimmy, heading straight for the heavy wooden workbench against the far wall. "Sit down, Jimmy," Leo said softly. Jimmy hesitated. The confident grin faltered, slipping at the edges. "I'm good, boss. Been sitting all night. Sit down." It was not a request. Jimmy swallowed hard and lowered himself back onto the wooden stool. The silence in the room stretched, punctuated only by the low, mechanical hum of the boiler. Leo stood at the workbench, his back turned. He reached out and placed his hands on the heavy, industrial steel vise bolted to the edge of the wood. He slowly spun the crank, opening the metal jaws wider. Squeak, squeak, squeak. The sound grated against Jimmy's nerves like sandpaper. A cold bead of sweat trickled down his spine. "You've been with me for 4 years, Jimmy," Leo said, his voice entirely conversational. He kept turning the crank. The jaws of the vise were now 6 inches apart. "In that time, you've earned me a considerable amount of money. You are violent. You are ruthless. Those are useful traits." "Thank you, boss," Jimmy replied, his voice tightening. He wiped his palms on his trousers. "I only do what's best for the family." "Yes, the family." Leo stopped spinning the crank. He turned around and leaned back against the workbench, crossing his arms. He looked Jimmy up and down, as if examining a piece of defective machinery. "I built this syndicate on a very specific set of rules. Order, discipline. We do not attract unnecessary police attention. We do not steal from our own, and we do not act like rabid dogs in my own home." Jimmy blinked, his heart hammering against his ribs. I don't understand, Leo. Have I done something? If it's about the docks, I swear. A girl walked into my dining room tonight, Leo interrupted, his voice dropping an octave. It was impossibly quiet, yet it commanded the entire room. She was carrying a tray of roasted lamb. She weighed perhaps 110 pounds soaking wet. She was serving my table, and her left arm was broken. Jimmy's breath hitched. His eyes darted nervously to Vincent, who remained completely motionless by the door. Now, Leo continued, taking a slow step forward. She lied to me. She told me she slipped on the ice. She tried to protect her job. She tried to protect you, but I am not a stupid man, Jimmy, and I despise liars. Panic, pure and suffocating, seized Jimmy's throat. Boss, wait! It wasn't like that. The bitch was disrespectful. She thought she was too good for us. I just pushed her, I swear to God. She tripped. It was an accident. You're going to take the word of a cleaning girl over one of your top earners. Leo stopped walking. He stood directly in front of Jimmy. The height difference was marginal, but Leo's sheer gravity made Jimmy look like a frightened child. I am not taking her word, Leo stated flatly. I am looking at the facts. You assaulted a civilian on my property. You left a trail of blood and liability behind my laundry house. You forced an injured girl to handle boiling food and silver near my guests, risking a scene. You let your temper override my order. Leo leaned down, his face inches from Jimmy's sweating forehead. You broke my property. You broke my peace. Jimmy tried to stand up, panic overriding his survival instinct. Leo, please! Leo moved with terrifying, blinding speed. His right hand shot out, grabbing Jimmy by the throat and slamming him backward. The stool tipped. Jimmy hit the concrete floor hard, gasping for air. Before he could recover, Vincent was there. The silent enforcer grabbed Jimmy by his right shoulder and hauled him up, dragging him toward the workbench. No, boss, wait, I'll pay her. I'll apologize. Jimmy thrashed, kicking wildly, but Vincent was built like a freight train. He slammed Jimmy's chest against the wooden bench, pinning him down. Leo walked calmly to the vise. He didn't blink. He didn't shout. Vincent grabbed Jimmy's left arm, twisting it violently, and shoved his hand and wrist directly between the open steel jaws of the vise. An eye for an eye is an old, boring cliché, Leo said, stepping up to the crank. He rested his hand on the metal handle. I prefer the concept of absolute disproportionate ruin. It prevents repeat offenses. Leo, please, God, please, Jimmy screamed, tears streaming down his face. He pulled frantically, but Vincent's weight was immovable. Leo looked down at the weeping, terrified man. He felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no rage, just the clinical necessity of maintaining his empire. And beneath that cold logic, a darker, sharper instinct, a primitive satisfaction at destroying the man who had put that look of sheer agony on Clara's face. You like to use your hands, Jimmy, Leo whispered. Let's see how you earn without them. Leo spun the crank. The heavy steel jaws slammed shut. The sickening crunch of shattering bone echoed through the damp basement. It was a loud, wet snap, immediately followed by an agonizing, breathless shriek that tore from Jimmy's throat before he blacked out entirely. Leo let go of the handle. He pulled a crisp linen handkerchief from his pocket and wiped his fingers. He looked at Vincent, who was already letting Jimmy's unconscious body slide to the floor. Take him to the county hospital. Dump him on the curb, Leo ordered softly. When he wakes up, tell him if I ever see his face in this city again, I will put his skull in that vice. Vincent nodded once. Leo turned and walked out of the basement. The boiler continued its low, steady hum. The private clinic smelled of bleach, expensive leather, and silence. Clara lay back on the plush, motorized hospital bed. The harsh fluorescent lights of standard emergency rooms were entirely absent here, replaced by soft, recessed amber lighting. For the first time in 36 hours, she wasn't in agonizing pain. The heavy dose of intravenous painkillers had wrapped her mind in a thick, warm blanket of fog. Dr. Aris, a grey-haired surgeon with a nervous tic near his left eye, had treated her with a level of frantic deference that terrified her. He hadn't asked for her insurance. He hadn't asked for her ID. When she tried to explain she couldn't afford an X-ray, he had physically paled and assured her that Mr. Castiglione's account covered everything. Her left arm was now encased in a lightweight, high-tech fiberglass, cast from her knuckles to her elbow. 2 titanium pins held her shattered radius in place. It throbbed with a dull, distant ache, a ghost of the fiery agony she had endured during the dinner service. "You're all set, miss," the nurse said softly, entering the room with a set of neatly folded clothes. "Thomas is waiting for you out front. He said to take your time." Clara sat up slowly, her head spinning slightly from the narcotics. She swung her legs over the bed. She fully expected Thomas to drive her back to her crumbling third-floor walk-up apartment in the city. She expected to be jobless, helpless, and drowning in the reality of trying to find work with one functioning arm. 10 minutes later, she climbed into the back of the black sedan. Thomas didn't ask for her address. He simply put the car in drive and headed straight back towards the Castiglione estate. "Wait," Clara said, her voice raspy. "Thomas, I can't go back there. I can't work. They'll just fire me. Just drop me at the subway station on 4th Street. Thomas met her eyes in the rearview mirror. His expression was completely neutral. "Mr. Castiglione gave me explicit instructions to bring you back to the estate, miss. I don't divert from his instructions." Clara sank back into the leather seats, anxiety piercing through the painkiller fog. Why was Leo bringing her back? Was he going to demand she pay off the medical bill? Was Jimmy waiting to finish what he started, now that Leo had played the benevolent boss? The sun was just beginning to crest over the horizon as the heavy iron gates of the estate parted. The sprawling grounds looked serene in the pale dawn light. Frost clung to the manicured lawns. Everything was perfectly quiet. Thomas bypassed the staff entrance entirely. He parked directly in front of the grand mahogany double doors of the main entrance. He got out and opened Clara's door. She stepped out, clutching her casted arm to her chest. She felt absurd walking through the front doors. She was wearing a pair of sweatpants and a clean t-shirt the clinic had provided, her hair a messy, tangled knot. As she walked into the massive marble foyer, she heard the hushed, frantic whispers coming from the adjacent dining hall. She approached slowly, peering around the corner. 3 maids were scrubbing the floors, their heads clustered together like frightened birds. "I'm telling you, it was Vincent who drove the car," one whispered furiously. "One of the guards at the gate told me. They dumped him at Mercy Hospital. They said his arm looked like it went through a wood chipper, completely crushed." "Jimmy?" another maid gasped. "But he's a Maid guy. He's an earner. The boss wouldn't do that to him over—" The maid trailed off, her eyes wide. "Over what?" the third demanded. "Over the girl," the first maid whispered, her voice trembling. "They said Leo found out what Jimmy did to the dishwasher. He didn't even yell. He just took him to the basement." Clara stopped breathing. The floor beneath her feet felt as though it were dropping away. A wood chipper, completely crushed. She staggered backward, bumping hard against a marble pillar. The sound echoed in the massive foyer. The maids stopped talking instantly, turning to look at her. Their eyes dropped down to the bright white fiberglass cast on her arm. Fear, raw and unfiltered, flashed across their faces. They didn't see a fellow worker anymore. They saw a walking, breathing execution order. They scattered instantly, grabbing their buckets and fleeing down the hall. Clara stood alone, her heart hammering wildly in her chest. The sheer scale of the violence committed on her behalf was incomprehensible. Men like Leo didn't break their own soldiers over a maid. It defied the fundamental rules of their world. "They gossip like children," a quiet voice echoed from the top of the grand staircase. Clara snapped her head up. Leo was descending the stairs. He was dressed flawlessly in a dark charcoal suit, a fresh white shirt, and a silver tie. He looked rested, calm, and utterly, completely terrifying in the morning light. He held a ceramic cup of black coffee in his hand. He reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped a few feet from her. His dark eyes immediately scanned the fiberglass cast. He lingered on it for a moment, a subtle tightening at the corner of his jaw, the only sign he felt anything at all. "Are you in pain?" he asked. His tone was casual, yet heavy with authority. "No," Clara managed to whisper. Her throat was desert dry. She looked up into his face. "Mr. Castiglione, what did you do?" Leo took a sip of his coffee. He didn't feign ignorance. He didn't offer a dramatic speech. "I corrected a structural flaw in my organization. You do not need to concern yourself with Jimmy O'Shea ever again." Clara's good hand gripped the fabric of her shirt. "I am a maid. I wash dishes. Men like you do not cripple your own men over a dishwasher. What do you want from me?" Her cynical, desperate honesty made Leo pause. For the first time, a shadow of genuine interest crossed his face. He stepped closer. The scent of his cedar cologne and sharp coffee enveloped her. "You are right. I do not do that for maids," Leo said, his voice dropping to a low, smooth cadence that sent a shiver down her spine. "But you carried a fractured radius through a 3-hour dinner service surrounded by predators, and you didn't drop a single plate. You have more spine than half the men sitting at my table." He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a heavy brass key. He held it out to her. "You are no longer washing dishes, Clara," he stated softly. "You are moving out of your apartment. This key opens the guest suite on the east wing. You will rest, you will heal, and when that cast comes off, you are going to work directly for me." The brass key felt unnaturally heavy in Clara's palm. It was cool metal, but it burned like a brand. She didn't pack. There was nothing in the staff locker room worth taking. Her coat was threadbare, her boots were scuffed, and her purse contained exactly $14 and a past-due electric bill. She walked down the long, carpeted hallway of the east wing, with nothing but the clothes on her back and the fiberglass cast heavy on her left arm. The estate was silent. The morning light filtered through tall, arched windows, casting long geometric shadows across the Persian rugs. Clara kept her back straight. Her mind, hardwired for poverty and survival, was spinning a frantic calculus. Men like Leo Castiglione did not run charities. They ran ledgers. Every gift was a loan with a staggering interest rate. Jimmy O'Shea had paid his debt with his hands. What exactly was Clara going to pay with? She reached the heavy oak door at the end of the hall. The brass plate read, "Guest Suite 4." She unlocked it and pushed the door open. The room was larger than the entire apartment she had shared with her mother before she died. It smelled of lemon oil and fresh linen. A massive king-sized bed dominated the center, piled high with heavy silk duvets. A marble fireplace stood on the far wall, already stacked with white birch logs. Clara stood in the doorway. She didn't feel relief. She felt the distinct, suffocating panic of a mouse realizing the cheese was sitting on a steel spring. She walked in and shut the door. She didn't sit on the bed. She walked straight to the window and looked out. The view overlooked the sprawling rear gardens and the high stone wall that encircled the property. There were security cameras mounted every 50 feet. 2 men in dark coats walked the perimeter with Belgian Malinois dogs. It wasn't a sanctuary. It was a very expensive terrarium. A sharp knock broke the silence. Clara flinched, her heart skipping a beat. "Come in," she called out, her voice raspy. The door opened. Beatrice, the head housekeeper, stepped inside. Yesterday, Beatrice had threatened to dock Clara's pay for using too much dish soap. Today, the older woman carried a stack of folded cashmere sweaters and silk pajamas, as if holding a ticking bomb. She kept her eyes glued to the floor. "Mr. Castiglione had his personal shopper pull these from the city," Beatrice said, her voice tight, completely stripped of its usual venom. "Toiletries are in the master bath. The kitchen will send up a tray at noon. Is there anything else you require, Miss Clara?" Miss Clara? The honorific made Clara's stomach turn. "Look at me, Beatrice," Clara said quietly. The housekeeper stiffened, slowly raising her eyes. Fear was stamped across her wrinkled face. She was looking at the white cast on Clara's arm. The entire staff had heard what happened in the basement. They all believed Clara was Leo's new mistress, or worse, a violent hidden variable they had failed to calculate. "Put the clothes on the chair," Clara instructed, "and stop shaking. I wash dishes. I don't kill people." Beatrice nodded quickly, dropping the clothes on the velvet armchair. She practically ran out of the room, pulling the door shut behind her with a soft click. Clara let out a slow, shaking breath. She walked over to the chair and ran her good hand over the folded cashmere. It was impossibly soft. It probably cost more than her car. She stripped off the cheap, oversized t-shirt the clinic had given her and carefully pulled a dark grey sweater over her head, wincing as she navigated the stiff fiberglass cast. She spent the next 8 hours waiting for the other shoe to drop. She paced the room. She ate the roasted chicken brought up on a silver tray, purely because her body demanded the calories. The painkillers Dr. Aris had injected were fading, replaced by a deep, throbbing ache in her wrist. The physical pain grounded her. It reminded her that this luxury was an illusion. At 7 o'clock that evening, the heavy oak door opened without a knock. Vincent stood in the threshold. He didn't wear a suit. He wore a dark, tactical sweater and cargo pants. He looked less like a bodyguard and more like a soldier stepping off a transport plane. "The boss wants you in the study," Vincent said. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble. Clara didn't argue. She slipped on a pair of soft wool trousers from the stack Beatrice had brought, took a deep breath, and followed the giant out into the hall. The walk to the west wing felt like a march to the gallows. They bypassed the grand staircase and moved through a pair of heavy mahogany doors that led into the estate's private offices. Vincent stopped in front of a frosted glass door, opened it, and stepped aside. Clara walked in. The study was dim, lit only by a heavy brass banker's lamp on a massive walnut desk. The walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. There was no computer on the desk. There were only stacks of manila folders, a crystal decanter of scotch, and an ashtray. Leo Castiglione sat behind the desk. He had shed his suit jacket and tie. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar. He looked tired, the sharp lines of his face cast in deep shadow. He didn't look up when she entered. He was turning a heavy silver lighter over and over in his hands. Click, click, click. "Sit down, Clara," he said. Clara took the leather chair opposite the desk. She kept her casted arm resting gently on her lap. She didn't sink into the cushions. She sat perched on the very edge, muscles coiled, waiting. Leo finally looked up. His dark eyes locked onto hers. He didn't offer a polite preamble. "You think I want to sleep with you?" Leo stated flatly. It wasn't a question. Clara's breath caught in her throat. The bluntness of the statement hit her like a physical blow. She forced herself not to look away. "It's the most logical explanation for why a man in your position puts a dishwasher in the East Wing." Leo chuckled. It was a short, dry sound, lacking any real humor. "If I wanted a mistress, Clara, I would buy one who doesn't look at me like I'm holding a loaded gun to her head. I have no interest in your bed. I am interested in your eyes." Clara frowned, her brow furrowing. "My eyes?" Leo leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "My business operates on information. I employ men who are very good at inflicting violence. I employ accountants who are very good at washing money. But violence and math are loud. They leave a trail. Survival in this city requires seeing the knife before it is drawn." He reached to his right and pulled a slim black laptop from beneath a stack of folders. He opened it, tapped a few keys, and turned the screen toward her. It was security footage from the dining room last night. The angle was high, capturing the entire long mahogany table. There was no audio. "You spent 3 hours standing in the shadows of that room," Leo said, his voice dropping to a low, clinical murmur. "You watched 12 of my highest-ranking captains drink my wine and eat my food. You were terrified. You were in agonizing pain. Yet, you navigated that room perfectly. You anticipated their movements to avoid being bumped. You watched their hands. Tell me what you saw." Clara stared at the screen. "You want me to inform on your men. I want you to tell me the truth," Leo corrected smoothly. "A maid sees everything because nobody looks at a maid. You are part of the furniture. They don't guard their faces around you." Clara looked at the frozen image on the screen. She recognized the heavy faces of the men she had served. She remembered the smell of their cigars, the heavy gold watches resting on the tablecloth. She remembered the sheer terror of trying to hold the silver tray steady. "I don't know anything about your business," she said cautiously. "I don't need you to know the business. I need you to know human nature." Leo tapped the heavy desk with one finger. "Play the tape in your head. Who was lying?" Clara closed her eyes. The cynical survivalist in her brain screamed to play dumb. If she pointed a finger, she was no longer a victim, she was a participant. But if she refused, she was useless to the man sitting across from her. And useless things were discarded. She opened her eyes and pointed her right index finger at the screen, tapping the blurry image of a man sitting 3 seats down from Leo's position. He had slicked back grey hair and a sharp, hawkish nose. "Him," Clara said quietly. Leo's eyes narrowed slightly. "Dominic. He runs the concrete unions. Why?" "He didn't drink," Clara replied, her voice gaining a fraction of confidence. "Every time I poured the Barolo, he brought the glass to his lips, but he never swallowed. He kept his hand over his stomach. When the man across from him started talking about the delays at the South Side docks, Dominic's left foot tapped the leg of the table. 3 rapid taps. He only did it when the docks were mentioned." Leo stared at her. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. "Furthermore," Clara continued, the adrenaline pushing her forward, "when you spoke, everyone else looked at you. Dominic looked at the door. He checked the exit 4 times in 2 hours. A man only checks the door that often if he expects someone to walk through it, or if he's calculating how fast he can get out." Leo slowly reached out and closed the laptop. The quiet snap of the plastic echoed in the dim rooms. He didn't smile. He didn't offer praise. He leaned back in his leather chair and stared at her with a terrifying, absolute clarity. "Dominic has been skimming from the pension funds for 6 months, Leo said softly. "I verified it an hour ago. Tomorrow he will disappear." Clara swallowed hard. The air in the room suddenly felt very thin. She had just handed a man a death sentence based on a tapping foot and a fake sip of wine. "You understand what this is, Clara," Leo said. It wasn't a question. "You are not a maid anymore. You are my shadow. You will attend every meeting. You will stand in the corner, pour the coffee, and remain entirely invisible. And when the room empties, you will tell me exactly who is planning to betray me." "And if I'm wrong?" she whispered. "You won't be," Leo replied, pouring 2 fingers of scotch into a heavy crystal glass. "Because if you are, my enemies will kill me. And without my protection, Jimmy O'Shea's brothers will skin you alive before my body is even cold." He slid the glass of amber liquid across the mahogany desk. It stopped inches from her casted arm. "Drink," Leo commanded softly. "Welcome to the family." The fiberglass cast was removed exactly 6 weeks later. In its place, Dr. Aris fitted Clara with a rigid black polymer brace that strapped tightly around her forearm. Her wrist was stiff. The skin was pale, scarred by the swelling, and the joint popped audibly when it rained. She didn't complain. The ache was a metronome, a constant, dull reminder of the night she traded a scrub brush for a place in the shadows. Her life at the estate had morphed into a strange, gilded purgatory. She no longer wore a maid's uniform. Beatrice silently delivered tailored, dark clothing to her room. Charcoal slacks, high-necked black silk blouses, flat-soled leather shoes. The wardrobe was designed for complete invisibility. Clara was meant to blend into the heavy oak paneling and velvet drapes of Leo's meeting rooms. And she did. She became a ghost pouring coffee. The capos and lieutenants barely noticed her. To them, she was just another piece of the boss's eccentric furniture. They didn't know she was the reason Dominic's body had been pulled from the harbour 3 days after that dinner. They didn't know she was the reason 2 of Leo's money launderers were quietly relocated to federal prisons on anonymous tips. But Leo knew. Their routine was rigid. After every meeting, the heavy doors of the study would lock. Leo would pour 2 fingers of scotch. He would sit behind his desk, light a cigarette, and wait. Clara would sit in the leather chair opposite him and dissect the men who had just sworn their undying loyalty. Tonight, the air in the study was thick enough to choke on. 10 minutes ago, Connell O'Shea had walked out the door. He was Jimmy's older brother, a man built like a meat freezer with a face ruined by bare-knuckle boxing. Connell had come to the estate under the guise of paying respects and discussing the Southside docks. He had smiled. He had kissed Leo's ring. He had sworn that Jimmy's accident was a tragic misunderstanding of family protocol, and that the O'Shea loyalty remained unbroken. Clara sat in her chair, her good hand gripping the armrest so hard her knuckles were white. Leo took a slow drag from his cigarette. The cherry burned a bright, angry orange in the dim room. He exhaled a long plume of grey smoke. "Well," Clara swallowed the dry lump in her throat. She looked at the empty crystal glass Connell had left on the side table. "He's going to kill you," Clara said flatly. Leo didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He tapped the ash from his cigarette into the glass tray. Connell smiled for an hour. "He offered me a 20% increase on the dock shipments. He didn't ask for a retaliation toll for his brother's hands." "That's exactly why," Clara replied, her voice gaining the cold, clinical edge she had learned from him. "Men like Connell don't forgive. They don't take losses. But he didn't look angry tonight. He looked completely relaxed. When you told him the docks would remain under Vincent's supervision for another month, Connell didn't argue. His breathing didn't change. His pupils didn't dilate. She leaned forward, pointing at the empty chair where the brute had sat. He didn't argue because he doesn't care. The decision doesn't matter to him. He's already stopped seeing you as the boss. He looks at you the way a butcher looks at a dead cow. The hit is already ordered, Leo. He wasn't here to negotiate. He was here to verify the security of the house. Silence fell over the room, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Leo stared at her. The harsh angles of his face were unreadable, but his eyes were entirely focused on her. There was no dismissal in his gaze. There was a dark, terrifying validation. He stood up slowly, walked over to the mahogany cabinet, and opened the bottom drawer. He didn't pull out a ledger. He pulled out a heavy, matte black Glock 19. He racked the slide with a sharp, metallic clack. The sound made Clara's stomach plummet. "They won't wait for tomorrow," Leo stated, his voice devoid of panic. He ejected the magazine, checked the brass casings, and slammed it back into the grip. If Connell was scouting, the strike team is already outside the gates. They know I run a skeleton crew on Thursday nights. Clara stood up, her pulse suddenly hammering against her eardrums. "Outside? You mean tonight? Right now?" "Yes." Leo walked around the desk. He stopped right in front of her. He reached out, his large, warm hand wrapping around her uninjured right arm. His grip was firm, grounding her spiraling panic. "You are going to go to the basement. You are going to lock the heavy steel door from the inside. You will not open it for anyone except me or Vincent." "What about you?" she whispered, staring at the gun in his hand. "I'm going to remind the O'Shea family why they answer to me." Leo said softly, "Go." Clara didn't make it to the basement. She had just reached the top of the grand staircase when the estate's lights violently flickered and died. Plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness, the massive house became a tomb. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds before the glass of the front conservatory windows shattered in a deafening, cascading roar. They weren't using silencers. Connell didn't want a quiet assassination. He wanted a siege. Heavy, frantic footsteps pounded across the marble foyer below. Muzzle flashes strobed blue and white in the darkness, illuminating the silhouettes of men in heavy tactical vests. The sharp, concussive cracks of automatic rifle fire tore through the plaster walls, sending clouds of white dust raining down on the stairs. Clara threw herself flat against the carpeted landing. Her black polymer brace scraped harshly against the floor. Panic, pure and acidic, clawed at her throat. She couldn't breathe. She scrambled backward, dragging herself away from the open balustrade, seeking the thick shadows of the East Wing corridor. Below her, a voice roared. "Clear the first floor! Find the boss! Find the girl!" Clara froze. Find the girl. They knew about her. Of course they did. The syndicate was a web of whispers. Connell knew a maid had sent his brother to the vice. She wasn't just collateral damage tonight, she was a primary target. Gunfire erupted from the West Wing. It was controlled, precise, and distinctly different from the chaotic spray of the intruders. 3 sharp cracks, 3 heavy thuds hitting the hardwood. Vincent had entered the fight. Clara forced herself onto her feet. She couldn't go to the basement. The foyer was swarming. Her only option was the panic room hidden behind the master suite library. She moved down the corridor, pressing her back against the wallpaper, moving purely by memory and the moonlight filtering through the high arch windows. She reached the intersection of the hallway when a massive shadow stepped out from the adjacent billiard room. The moonlight caught the glint of a rifle barrel. Clara stopped breathing. She stood perfectly still, merging with the darkness of the heavy velvet curtains. The intruder was 10 feet away. He was breathing heavily, his head turning mechanically as he scanned the empty hall. He took a step forward. His heavy boot crunched on a piece of broken plaster. He was going to see her. The moment he passed the window, the moonlight would hit her face. Clara's mind raced. She had no weapon. She had one good hand. She looked at the heavy brass lamp resting on the console table beside her. It weighed at least 10 pounds. She calculated the distance. She calculated her own fractured strength. Survival wasn't about being fearless. It was about moving faster than your terror. As the gunman stepped into the shaft of moonlight, Clara lunged. She swung her right arm, grabbing the brass lamp by its neck, and brought it down with every ounce of frantic, desperate leverage she possessed. The heavy metal base slammed directly into the side of the gunman's temple. The man didn't cry out. The impact made a sickening, wet thwack. He immediately collapsed, his rifle clattering loudly against the hardwood floor. Clara dropped the lamp. She stumbled backward, gasping for air, staring at the motionless body at her feet. Her hands were shaking violently. The cynical maid who washed plates was gone, replaced by a woman standing over a bleeding man in the dark. Before she could move, a cold hand clamped over her mouth. Clara screamed into the palm, violently thrashing her elbows backward. A hard, unyielding chest trapped her against the wall. "Stop!" The whisper was an inch from her ear. The scent of gunpowder, cedar, and blood flooded her senses. Clara instantly went limp. The hand dropped from her mouth. She spun around to face Leo. His white shirt was smeared with dark crimson across the ribs. His eyes were completely black in the dim light, wild and dilated with pure adrenaline. He looked down at the unconscious man on the floor, then back at Clara. He noticed her violently shaking hands. He noticed the sheer terror in her eyes. "Are you hit?" he demanded, his voice a low, harsh rasp. "No," she choked out. "You're bleeding." "It's not mine." Leo reached out and gripped her face with his free hand. His thumb traced her cheekbone, pulling her focus away from the body, forcing her to look only at him. It was an intensely intimate gesture, raw and uncalculated. "Look at me. Breathe." Clara dragged in a ragged breath. The chaos downstairs seemed to fade into a dull roar. "Vincent is sweeping the perimeter." "Connell is dead," Leo said softly, his thumb gently brushing a streak of plaster dust from her jaw. "It's over." Clara looked into the eyes of the man who ruled a criminal empire. She had just killed or maimed a man to protect his house. The realization settled over her like a heavy lead blanket. "I didn't hide in the basement," she whispered, her voice trembling. Leo looked at the brass lamp, then back at her. A slow, dark realization shifted in his expression. It wasn't just respect anymore. It was absolute, undeniable possessiveness. "No," Leo murmured, his hand sliding to the back of her neck, pulling her forehead down to rest against his chest. "You didn't." The dawnlight crept through the shattered conservatory windows, catching the floating motes of plaster dust. The estate smelled of cordite, copper, and the sharp chemical tang of industrial bleach. The bodies had been moved before the sun fully breached the horizon. Vincent and a crew of entirely silent men had scrubbed the marble foyer, leaving only damp, pale streaks on the stone where the O'Shea family's rebellion had bled out. Clara sat in the heavy leather chair of Leo's study. The adrenaline had evaporated, leaving her hollowed out, her muscles aching with a deep, bone-deep exhaustion. Her right hand was wrapped in clean white gauze. The brass lamp had split the gunman's skull, but the impact had torn the skin off her own palm. Leo stood by the mahogany desk. He had finally changed out of the blood-stained shirt. He wore a simple black turtleneck and dark slacks. He looked entirely unaffected by the violence of the night, save for a slight rigidity in his jaw. He poured 2 glasses of water, crossed the room, and handed one to her. Clara took it with her left hand, the black polymer brace clicking softly against the glass. "The man in the hallway," Clara said. Her voice was raspy, stripped of any inflection. "Is he dead?" "Yes," Leo replied flatly. He didn't offer comforting lies. He leaned against the edge of the desk, looking down at her. "He suffered a depressed skull fracture. He did not wake up." Clara stared into the clear water in her glass. She waited for the guilt to hit her. She waited for the panic of taking a human life to crush her chest. But it didn't come. Instead, there was only a cold, terrifying acceptance. That man had intended to put a bullet in her spine. She had simply moved first. "You are waiting for the horror to set in," Leo observed quietly, reading the microscopic shifts in her expression. "It won't. You survived. Your brain is prioritizing the oxygen in your lungs over the morality of how it got there. That is not a defect, Clara. It is a requirement for the life you have just stepped into." "I was a dishwasher," she whispered, looking up at him. 6 weeks ago, my biggest fear was missing rent. And today, you killed a Maid man to defend a syndicate you aren't even a sworn member of." Leo reached out, his fingers lightly brushing the edge of her black brace. "The universe rarely cares about what we used to be." A heavy knock sounded at the study door. Vincent stepped inside. He looked bruised, a dark purple swelling closing his left eye, but his posture was completely rigid. "The remaining captains are here, boss," Vincent rumbled. "They are waiting in the formal dining room. They saw the gates. They know about Connell." "Good," Leo said, stepping away from the desk. "Let them wait and sweat for exactly 5 minutes." Vincent nodded and stepped back out, closing the door. Leo turned back to Clara. He held out his hand. Clara looked at his open palm. She understood exactly what this meant. If she stayed in this room, she was just collateral damage that survived the night. She could ask for a car. She could take a payout, leave the city, and disappear into middle-class obscurity. Leo would likely let her go. She had paid her debt in the hallway, but looking at Leo's hand, she realized the most terrifying truth of all. She didn't want to leave. The cynical, desperate girl who scraped plates for minimum wage had died when Jimmy pushed her down those concrete stairs. The woman sitting in the chair had found power in the shadows, and she had no intention of relinquishing it. Clara reached up and placed her bandaged right hand in his. Leo pulled her to her feet. He didn't let go. He led her out of the study, down the long corridor, and toward the heavy double doors of the formal dining room. The low hum of anxious, panicked conversation bled through the heavy oak. 8 men sat around the mahogany table. They were the survivors, the captains who hadn't sided with Connell O'Shea. They were terrified. They expected to walk into a room smelling of blood and face a tyrant demanding executions. Leo pushed the doors open. Absolute silence fell over the room instantly. The men stood up, their chairs scraping loudly against the hardwood floors. They looked at Leo, expecting him to walk to the head of the table. Instead, Leo stopped at the chair immediately to his right. The seat traditionally reserved for the underboss. He pulled the chair out. Every eye in the room shifted. They finally noticed the woman standing beside him. Some recognized her as the maid who had awkwardly served lamb 6 weeks ago. Others didn't recognize her at all. They saw the black brace on her arm. They saw the white bandages on her right hand. They saw the cold, unblinking way she stared back at them. Clara stepped forward and sat down in the underboss's chair, A collective silent shock rippled through the 8 hardened criminals. Veins popped in forearms, jaws clenched, but no one said a word. No one reached for a weapon. They looked at Leo, and they saw the absolute, terrifying finality in his dark eyes. Leo pushed Clara's chair in. He walked to the head of the table and sat down. He didn't introduce her. He didn't explain her. He didn't have to. The message was deafeningly loud. "Gentlemen," Leo said smoothly, his voice echoing in the ruined, dust-filled room. "The O'Shea family is permanently retired. We have a great deal of logistics to restructure before noon. Clara will be managing the ledger. Let's begin." Clara rested her black polymer brace on the mahogany table. She looked at the 12 men. She watched a lieutenant's hand tremble as he reached for a pen. She watched a captain's eye twitch as he tried not to stare at her bandages. She saw every lie, every fear, every silent surrender. She wasn't hiding anymore. In the underworld, power isn't given. It's taken in the dark and solidified in the morning light. Clara went from a terrified maid hiding a broken bone to the untouchable right hand of the city's most dangerous man, proving that sometimes the quietest casualties become the deadliest players. If this gritty, tension-fueled Mafia drama kept you on the edge of your seat, support the channel. Hit that like button, share this video with fellow dark romance fans, and subscribe for more intense, slow-burn stories. Would you have stayed in the house like Clara? Sound off in the comments below.